Spring 2021, Mazar-i-Sharif, Afghanistan. Along with my Finnish squad of soldiers, I am packing down our equipment and base after the US has essentially allowed Taliban back into power and was withdrawing from the conflict with its tail between its legs. The base where we were stationed, Camp Marmal, had a wide range of soldiers from different NATO and allied nations who were all getting ready to depart Afghanistan after a 20-year battle. Next to our Finnish headquarters, the German contingent had packed and shipped most of their stuff back to Germany. Some buildings down in the American part of the base, it looked like a riot had occurred. Trucks, ammunition, weaponry, and very expensive assets like equipment to locate IEDs and expensive medical supplies cooked in the Afghan spring sun in what appeared to be a badly executed escape. For a nation who prides itself on spending a lot on its military, there was likely a few $1 million worth of equipment being either left behind or ruined by the elements every single day. And Camp Marmal was by far not the largest base for US operations in the country. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces. In this episode, we'll delve into Europe's defense spending and explore why the often cited magic percentage of GDP isn't the most reliable metric for guiding the ongoing rearmament debate in Europe. We'll examine the inefficiencies and the accounting methods that allow the US to report a defense spending of 3.4% of its GDP in 2024, and why a big spend doesn't always equate to a lot of bang for your buck. Compared to my own country, where we take care of and respect our equipment because taxpayers are being burdened to pay for it, it seemed to myself and soldiers from other NATO nations like the opposite was taking place within the American forces as we left Afghanistan. This situation exemplifies what we'll talk about today, namely why defense spending doesn't necessarily equate to military might. I will use my own country to compare with other nations a lot in this episode, so if you're Finnish and faint of heart when it comes to talking about our own country, I apologize in advance. But I feel like some grounding is prudent in these very troublesome times. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Europe has generally somewhat toned down its military spending, as we did not have a nuclear-armed giant at our doorstep anymore. But during the last years, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and more recently Donald Trump and his team questioning whether or not the US would enforce Article 5, this has changed drastically. If we dive a bit deeper into the figures, European NATO members generally spent a quite substantial part of their GDP on defense during the Cold War. In the 1960s, the average military spending for the nations who are now part of the EU was on average 4%, while the UK spent around 5.5% of GDP as late as 1984, and Sweden spent over 3% until 1980. As the USSR fell, so did the big conventional threat to Europe, and defense spending fell almost entirely across the board, with a few notable nations holding their spending well over 2%, including Greece, Poland, the UK, and France. It's worth noting that even though Finland typically has had the largest artillery and manpower reserve in Europe since the Cold War, defense spending has typically not been over 2% of GDP since 1962, which is testament to the fact that big sums of money doesn't necessarily equate to a proper military force. By combining clever acquisitions, European production, and a proper reserve system, Europe can adopt the same effective but punchy stance which can be seen in Finland. And now we'll look at how my countrymen achieve so much bang for their buck, compared to an example the US. First, let's look at the US defense budget. Generally, the budget is split along the following lines: personnel costs, operation and maintenance, procurement, research, development, test and evaluation, construction, military aid, atomic weaponry, and miscellaneous, which includes intelligence, space operations, communications, and so forth. In total, including the aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, it came to $816 billion in 2023. I think we can all agree that this is a whole lot of money. However, as with everything in life, it is worth digging deeper and comparing with other nations. And since I have been involved in the Finnish military for what feels like half a lifetime, I'll compare with Finland. Let's start with personnel. Now, I know that some of you will likely find this comparison quite comical, but I think it will underline some of the thoughts we'll later address in this video, being that Europe do not need a huge contingent of active duty troops, but rather a fine balance between a professional corps of soldiers and a massive pool of well-trained reserves. Whereas one US reserve and active duty soldier currently costs the American state over $93,000 via the defense budget, one Finnish soldier costs around 1,600 euros. Now, let's get into why. There are several reasons for this huge disparity, whereas the Finnish pension, healthcare and societal systems are much more comprehensive. Things that the American defense budget has to cover for their active and reserve personnel is covered under other budgets in Finland. Just the health insurance for American personnel and veterans alone was recently estimated at $61 billion, whereas the costs would be the same for the Finnish state for its soldiers' healthcare, no matter their military or civilian status. The second part of the American budget where I think Europe could likely be a lot more effective is the research and development sector. In 2023, the US spent a staggering $100 billion plus on development, much of which never actually produced an end result. Take items such as the Freedom-class littoral ships, the Comanche helicopter, the Zumwalt destroyer, or any number of the extremely costly failures of the American defense industry, which has squandered somewhere along the lines of several tens of billions of dollars in the last 20 or so years. In reality, the trillion-euro injection which now seems to be coming from Europe into their defense industry needs to be applied much more cautiously than what the American research and development projects have been. As we've covered in our previous videos, which I'll leave a playlist for in the comments and description, Europe already makes a lot of great stuff. Ideally, a lot of the money should be used to streamline and increase production, and it should encourage multinational cooperations like we've seen with the Boxer, Leopard 2 and Leclerc hybrid, our 6th generation fighter programs and so forth. As the war in Ukraine has shown, procurement does not need to be the most flashy or technologically advanced in order to defeat the only credible threat to Europe. What it should prioritize is getting its vast production capacity in order, which would mean asking large manufacturers of, in example, cars and machinery to also make military equipment. I know it might sound frightening to some to ask German automakers to start making tanks again, but in order for Europe to increase its capacity fast and get the most out of our money, this is the only good way to do it. France is likely the country in Europe which has the largest independent in-house capacity to create their own ITA-free equipment without American parts, and this route is likely what the rest of us will need to follow. Now, back to the original train of thought. While the American defense spending is massive, it also includes other items which frankly no European state would ever need to spend money on. Take in example the VA, or Veterans Affairs, who in 2023 spent a staggering $301 billion on programs to help the many US veterans who have served their country and returned to civilian life. While I know and admire many good American veterans, this money would again be something which European social programs would catch in other budgets. And frankly, I don't think I even know one European combat veteran who lives on the street, like the now 35,000 homeless veterans in the US. So, what could Europe get for its trillion-dollar defense boost? Depending on what form of conscription and reserve system European nations go for, it could likely fund twice the amount of current active and reserve soldiers on the continent, which currently sits at around 1.4 million active service members and roughly 3 times that in reserves. But I don't necessarily think Europe would need an army double the size of the US armed forces. Around 1990, European NATO members had somewhere along the lines of 3 million active duty personnel, though evolving warfare, especially with unmanned systems, could heavily alleviate the need for so many active troops. Where I think Europe should focus is on giving a bigger part of its population basic training, akin to what Poland is currently doing with its entire male population. 1 trillion euros wouldn't just be used for additional personnel, so to get a deeper understanding of what it could be used for, I'll take some of the equipment that I expect the European allied nations to get, and then we'll go from there. Many people have had ideas about the distribution of funding for these new defense initiatives across EU member states. but let's assume it's proportional to each country's population size as suggested in some of the meetings so far. For illustrative purposes, we'll consider a medium-sized country like the Netherlands, with a population of approximately 18 million people. We'll focus on how they might benefit from their proportional size of the 800 billion euros the EU plans to spend on these initiatives. 18 million inhabitants accounts for 4% of the EU population, which means that the Netherlands could be allotted somewhere around 32 billion euros extra on top of their 24 billion defense budget, which would realistically be a 133% increase. The current Dutch armed forces sit at an operational capacity as follows. If we include civilian workers in the armed forces, they've got around 74,000 active and reserve personnel. A 133% increase would land them in the territory of 174,000 total personnel. Once we get to equipment, the equation becomes somewhat different as equipment costs increases with time. But with some basic calculations, hardware for the armed forces of a nation generally accounts for about 20 to 30% of the defense budget. With their allotted 32 billion, this would mean that the Netherlands could be left with 8 billion for new purchases. The current Dutch armed forces big-ticket items are as follows: F-35s, Leopard 2, CV-90, Boxer, Bushmasters, Manticores, PZH-2000, NASAMS and Patriots, and they displace somewhere around 140,000 tons in their navy. In recent years, most of the Dutch defense spending has gone to the army, and I expect that this trend will likely continue as the threat to Europe will likely mainly be on land. So for illustrative purposes, let's say that the Netherlands will keep around 10% of their possible newfound defense investments for the Air Force, as most of their new F-35 fleet has been delivered, and possibly 20% for the Navy, and we're left with 70% out of the 32 billion for army purchases. This means that the Dutch would have 22 additional billions for the army. To put this into perspective, 22 billions could get the Dutch over 729 million euro Leopard 2 tanks, or alternatively, if the Dutch wanted everyone in their army to be sat inside a CV-90, they could buy over 5,000 of their 3.9 million euro CV-90NL variants. If they wanted to upgrade their air defenses, they could buy 88 250 million NASAMS batteries, complete with radars, missiles and the lot. Now, I know that these sort of calculations are speculations, and no one in their right mind needs 5,000 CV-90s for a little over 100,000 active personnel. A large part of this cash will also likely be used to expand production in order to be able to produce a meaningful quantity of equipment. It doesn't help to have all the money in the world if KNDS or BAE can only make 50 tanks and 100 CV-90s a year, but it sort of gives people a ballpark figure of what an unleashed European continent could do with their armed forces. To reiterate and summarize, it is important that Europe does not fall into the American trap where money is downright wasted right, left and center. Our current platforms, as we've shown in our now quite long series on European military technology, is more than good enough to stand up against Russia. Focus needs to be put on production capability and creating jobs in the defense industry, which will in turn give a large part of the money invested back in the form of taxes and profits. By outsourcing our military production to America for decades, we've essentially gutted what used to be a very prosperous defense industry, which we'll now need to once again build up. And in the long run, that is the only right thing to do. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a wonderful weekend. Spring has finally started to come to Finland, and I hope you're all getting some well-deserved spring sunshine too.